This podcast is brought to you by the School of Advanced Study, University of London.
And we'll now launch into our second keynote. And I'm really delighted to be able to welcome Professor Alison Landsberg, who's a professor in the History and Art History departments at George Mason University, Washington, D.C. And Professor Landsberg is an internationally recognised scholar in the field of memory studies. Her first book, Prosthetic Memory, The Transformation of American Remembrance in the Age of Mass Culture, considers the ways in which individuals are increasingly able to physically take on memories of events they did not live through. And one of the reasons I was keen to invite Alison here today is because her writing about bodies, media, and memories has been really influential in my work. So although she's not talking about dance, we're kind of expanding the field out here to talk about bodies in relation to media and memories, which I think will inform more of our discussions. Her most recent book, Engaging the Past, explores popular modes of engagement with the past in contemporary mediated society and the ramifications of those modes of engagement for the projects of history and politics. And today she'll present a paper entitled Ghosts on Screen, The Politics of Intertemporality.
Thank you. I want to begin by thanking Clare. Absolutely delighted to be here. It's so kind of you to extend this invitation. I also want to thank Selena for helping me actually get here. She was very, very lovely and helpful. And I'm honored to be part of this conference. My work, as Clare said, is not on dance. However, I have an abiding interest in embodiment and, as Clare also said, in the ways in which individuals engage with mediated representations on film and television. And that's kind of what I'll be talking about today. At the end of 1916, Cecil B. DeMille made what was, in his words, his, quote, first big historical film about the life of Joan of Arc, entitled Joan the Woman. The film's action, however, begins not in the 15th century, but in the present, as an intertitle clarifies, 1916, an English trench somewhere in France. The film opens onto two soldiers in their quarters. One, Eric Trent, notices something in the wall and calls his companion over to see. Trent pulls out a sword, turns it over in his hands, and reflects on its provenance. The two soldiers are then summoned to speak with a captain who's seeking a volunteer to carry a bomb to the enemy trench. Think it over, they are told, for the man who goes will not come back. With the weight of the decision on their shoulders, the men head back to their quarters. An intertitle with a single word flashes on the screen: memory. So I'm going to show you this scene when they're back in the room. That's obviously the sword that he's handling. And there appears an image of Joan of Arc. Into the past. Okay, so he has this vision of Joan of Arc. She appears as a ghost before him. And then when the next scene begins, we're in a small town in 15th century France. By means of this historical flashback, DeMille has linked the present with the past through the figure of a ghost. In this talk, I will connect two texts, one cinematic and one televisual, separated by 100 years. Joan the Woman and the 2015 television series Mr. Robot from the USA Network. These seem like strange bedfellows, I know, but it will soon be clear what they have in common. While ghosts have figured on the screen since its earliest days, Joan the Woman is the first historical film to make use of a ghost, and as such, it stages quite dramatically the way the filmic medium enables a certain kind of serious play with temporality. This film's historical flashback posits the interdependence of two temporalities, the 15th century past and the 20th century World War I present, and it does this through the ghost of Joan of Arc. Underscoring the importance of this point, the intertitle, immediately preceding the narrative action, declares, "Joan of Arc is not dead, she can never die, and in the war-torn land she loved so well, her spirit fights today." This ghost, the ghost of Joan of Arc, who appears in the trenches, has not come for retribution or to right the wrongs of the past, so much as to catalyze action in the present in order to change the course of history. What I'll point to in this talk is the power of cinematic technology to materialize ghosts, a fundamental ontological impossibility, as a mechanism for confronting the past and its legacies on behalf of the future. Cinematic or televisual ghosts work in two dimensions, on the characters and on the viewers. Seeing the impossible, that about which one cannot immediately make sense, is frightening and destabilizing, but at the same time compelling. The experience is at first affective, in that one experiences shock and fear or disbelief, but also has a cognitive dimension. Processing the appearance of a ghost requires intellectual work on the part of those who have witnessed it. A ghost is a provocation, forcing those in its midst to rethink what they thought they knew, what they assumed to be true. And of course, this has political ramifications. Being forced to question what we accepted to be true shocks us. One could even say that it wakes us, in Walter Benjamin's sense, from our passive existence in a reified world to see it as it truly is, a prison world. In the 2015 television series Mr. Robot, a cinematic, or in this case, televisual ghost's presence urges both the protagonist and the audience to quite literally wake up from their complacency in order to bring about a massive economic and social revolution. There's been a great deal of scholarly interest in ghosts, so much that Jeffrey Andrew Weinstock has pointed to what he has called the spectral turn. Avery Gordon's Ghostly Matters, Haunting and the Sociological Imagination, is one of the earliest attempts to theorize ghosts and hauntings as manifestations of suppressed or unexpressed social and political realities. She writes that haunting is one way in which abusive systems of power make themselves known and their impacts felt in everyday life, especially when they are supposedly over and done with, slavery for instance, or when their oppressive nature is denied, as in free labor or national security. In the case of a haunting, a repressed or unresolved social violence is making itself known, sometimes very directly, sometimes more obliquely. When home becomes unfamiliar, when your bearings and on the world lose direction, when the over and done with comes alive, when what's been in your blind spot comes into view. The ghost emerges at precisely the moment that the trouble, of which it is a symptom, is no longer contained or repressed or blocked from view. It has a real presence and demands its due, your attention. Perhaps most importantly, she distinguishes haunting from trauma. Instead of obsessively rehearsing the past, haunting is, in her words, distinctive for producing a something to be done. In Spectres of Marx, a text meant to reconcile Marxism with deconstruction, Jacques Derrida begins with and continually circles back to the ghosts in Marx's writings, pointing out their political and ethical dimensions. For Derrida, a discussion of ghosts is always in the name of justice. To even begin to imagine ethics or politics of any kind, Derrida claims, begins with those others who are no longer, or those others who are not yet there, presently living. whether they are already dead or not yet born. He continues, no justice seems possible or thinkable without the principle of some responsibility beyond all living present, within that which disjoins the living present, before the ghosts of those who are not yet born or who are already dead, be they victims of wars, political or other kinds of violence, nationalist, racist, colonialist, sexist, or other kinds of exterminations, victims of the oppression of capitalist imperialism or any of the forms of totalitarianism. It's not simply that the ghost embodies the injustices of the past. Rather, the ghost, appearing in the space of the present, indicates that there is work to be done to prevent further injustice in the future. It registers a call to action. The ghost instantiates a kind of intertemporality that is always already political. So, despite the ephemeral appearance of the ghost, the promise that it demands from those who perceive it must be anything but ephemeral. Writes Derrida, it must produce events, new effective forms of action, practice, organization, and so forth. What's striking about these accounts is their investment in futurity. In an essay on Derrida's text, Frederick Jameson suggests that these motifs of ghosts and haunting correspond to what I would myself be tempted to call the utopian. Spectrality is here the form of the most radical politicization that, far from being locked into the repetitions of neurosis and obsession, it is energetically future-oriented and active. These ghosts from the past, which appear in the present, hover at the threshold of a different future. I'm suggesting in this talk that the cinema has a privileged relationship with the ghost, enabling its representation as corporeal and yet decorporealized, often signaled by its semi-transparency, in a way utterly impossible before the invention of the technology. Murray Leader opens his collection of essays entitled Cinematic Ghosts with the observation that tricking the viewer and representing ghosts have been projects of film since its first days. Indeed, early filmmakers reveled in the medium's ability to perform visual tricks and substitutions. Much of this power derives from cinema's origin in photography. In his groundbreaking work on spirit photography, a type of photography popular in the late 19th century that sought to capture the images of ghosts and spirits, Tom Gunning has noted that this convergence of modern media and the spirit world revolves, at least in its visual manifestation, around a phantasmatic body, visible and yet insubstantial, an image separated from its physical basis, or somehow strangely rarefied, become transparent, a phantom almost. And here's an image of a spirit photograph. You can see the ghost appearing and the person pulling back in horror. Gunning points to the shadowy ontological status of the ghost as a virtual image, a visual experience that somehow differs from common perception. The photographic image, as a scientific technology, was thought to be able to prove or literalize the existence of ghosts, but in a paradoxical way. For as Gunning writes, a photograph renders visible, in objective form, the immaterial phantasms that the optical revolution had exercised. Crucial to Gunning's understanding of the power of spirit photography, why people believed it, was the fact that a photograph is both an iconic and an indexical sign. It's iconic in that the representation looks like what it's representing, but it's indexical in that it was actually there at the same time as the original, and in fact captured something of that space and moment on the photographic paper. Moreover, it was imagined as an objective tool for capturing reality. Furthermore, the modern filmic technology enabled a confrontation between humans and ghosts, between the free-floating phantom and a world of flesh and blood creatures. The ghost compels us because it challenges our ability to read reality, to rely on our senses, and because it interferes with temporality. In Gunning's words, it represents a return to the past, not in the form of memory or history, but in a contradictory experience of presence. In the ghost, the past has quite literally materialized in the present, forcing itself on those in its midst. It commands both space and attention, and compels those whom it confronts to think critically about the relationship of the past and the present, but also the implications of that past for the present and the future. Motion pictures offered new possibilities for the depiction of specters. The virtuosity of film as a medium enabled it quite literally to bring to life a ghost. The early French filmmaker Georges Méliès, most famous for his trick films, celebrated the medium's ability to perform magic, to create visions, and to render the unreal real. Catherine Kovach described how Méliès uses filmic technology to create visual ghosts. Méliès would film the apparition before or after shooting the scene on a white background, stop the camera, wind back the film, and reshoot in order to obtain superimposition. Sometimes he would place a piece of muslin gauze over the lens to give a hazy, indistinct appearance to the image. I'm going to show you an example from Méliès's film, The Haunted Castle. The point here is that the movie camera, in the hands of some of its earliest practitioners, was uniquely able to materialize ghosts. Ghosts are able to compel, perhaps the first instance of a filmic ghost manifesting a moral imperative, testifying to work yet to be done, appeared in the filmic versions of Charles Dickens's A Christmas Carol, which was made and remade obsessively over the first 2 decades of the 20th century. Importantly, these ghosts are themselves temporally marked beings, ghosts of Christmas past, present, and future. These ghosts are meant to motivate action, to encourage Ebenezer Scrooge to change his ways, to bring about a different future. This is from a 1910 version. I'll show you just a short clip of this. Ghosts are able to compel this change because they work on an affective register and because their impossibility demands intellectual processing by the humans they confront. Even in these earliest incarnations, ghosts are imagined to foster an affective response, shock, fear, and disbelief. Though Scrooge knows them to be specters, he reaches out to them, tries to touch them. Ghosts strike fear precisely because we know intellectually that they're not real, and yet we are confronted with sensuous evidence of their presence. They manifest an impossible intertemporality, a meeting of past and present. In that moment of destabilization, there's work to be done. The character is shaken from his or her complacency, forced to confront a past event that has led to inequities in the present. Scrooge is confronted with the suffering of Tiny Tim and an image of his own lonely death, which catalyze a moment of anguish and soul-searching, together compelling a change in his course of action. Like A Christmas Carol, Joan the Woman also uses a ghost to catalyze a course of action in the present, but applies this approach to the genre of the historical film. The ghost of Joan of Arc is instrumental to the structure of Joan the Woman, as she links the frame narrative, the story that takes place in the trenches of World War I, with the story of Joan of Arc's life. The link between the past and the present is made all the more forcibly by the fact that Eric Trent, in a previous incarnation, was an English soldier with whom Joan has many encounters. The frame narrative gives the film its political edge, mobilizing history in the service of the needs of the present. This was not lost on contemporary viewers. Many reviews point to the relevance of the story to audiences. An article in the Chicago Defender points out, quote, "There's a certain timeliness about the story of Joan of Arc, as it has been repeated frequently from France, that public interest in the Maid of Orleans was never so keen as at the present time." An article in the Washington Post goes so far as to suggest that it will do more patriotic work than a dozen recruiting sergeants, set as it is in the midst of a modern story of the trenches. This idea appeared perhaps in its most stark form in a piece in the Los Angeles Times about the Allied governments negotiating over using the film, quote, "as part of an advertising campaign to secure more recruits for their armies," end quote. Representatives of the French government were keen to have it shown all over France, and the English government, also interested in using it for recruitment, said that they had, quote, used cinema in various ways as a means of gaining volunteers. But this will be the first time a photodramatic story in its entirety, dealing with history, has ever been used in this manner, end quote. Much of the power this particular ghost of Joan has over us, though, is derived from our sense of connection to her, which is fostered by the rest of the film. We watch as her 15th century self, a flesh and blood person, chooses to fight for ideals that she believes in. As DeMille himself admits, the ghost alone would not be a powerful device without the impassioned story of Joan that the film goes on to depict. Writes DeMille, quote, "The most spectacular action or photographic effects will not carry a weak or poorly constructed story. The audience is interested in people, not masses of anonymous people, but individuals whom they can love or hate, in whose fortunes they can feel personally involved," end quote. The reviews for the film were overwhelmingly favorable, virtually all of them pointing to its capacity to move the spectator. Peter Milne, writing for Motion Picture News, proclaims, "As you sit in your chair, you are alternately swayed by grim struggle of battle, the thrill of conquest, the tragedy of the unjust death meted out to Joan of France. But through it all, because of the magnificent inspirational performance of Geraldine Farrar, you feel yourself inspired." We as viewers become invested in the ghost because we have spent time with her as a person in the past fighting for what she believes in. Joan's life is made to matter to us affectively for the purpose of achieving a particular political outcome. One strain of current scholarship on affect follows Baruch Spinoza, who has emphasized affect's importance for politics and ethics. The idea that affect functions like potential, the not yet, which in turn is crucial for thinking about political activation. Because affect is never fixed, it moves through and between bodies. Indeed, the transmission of affect need not be imagined only as moving from live body to live body, but from screen to person, precisely because of the intimacy of the experience of cinematic viewing, which makes us feel ourselves to have a stake in those events. Sarah Ahmed described his potential to activate us, explaining, "We are moved by things, and in being moved, we make things." When we are brought into proximity with something, she suggests, it has a greater capacity to move or affect us. And of course, this is in part the project of cinema, to bring distant things close. It's precisely the horror of Joan's death, her torturous and graphic burning at the stake, that's responsible for rendering her a ghost in the 20th century, and that makes her a powerful political agent for change in the present. Ghosts, after all, have ethical gravitas. They appear on behalf of those who have died wrongly. Joan of Arc's death by fire is long and gruesome, difficult to watch even for contemporary audiences. The film cuts between Joan and the villagers who are watching the spectacle in order to show us their horror and fear. As she burns, the smoke wafts up to the stands, and even the bishop who sentenced her has to look away. The crowds are sickened. Trent cries, "God forgive us, we have burnt a saint," and then collapses to the ground. She's engulfed in smoke, but stretches her arms toward us. The scene goes to blackness, and we are returned to the English soldiers in the trenches. Trent awakens, looks at his clock. He kisses the sword, puts on his hat, and goes to see his superior. He takes the bomb, and embarks on his suicide mission. As he crawls across no man's land, he's shot, but manages to throw the bomb into enemy territory. Huge curls of smoke appear, echoing Joan's death. As Trent lies dying on the ground, the specter of Joan appears in the center of the screen, looming above him. She reaches toward him and then brings her hands together as if in prayer. She did what she set out to do. She compelled Trent to act in the present, not to rectify the crime of the past. The horror of witnessing her death by fire and the impossibility of her presence in the present are meant to provoke the viewer, to force him or her to engage in cognitive work, to consider the relation of the past and the present, and to learn to take a stand for what he or she believes in. I want now to jump 100 years to 2015 to another instance when a cinematic, or in this case, televisual ghost appears to compel a character to carry out a moral and political mission. While film and television are replete with ghosts, most commonly in the horror genre, I'm pointing here again to the use of a ghost not in the service of horror, but in the service of a political ideal. Even though such a ghost doesn't provoke fear exactly, the experience of it, both for the character and the viewer, is both strongly affective and cognitively challenging. The experience of shock and disorientation force both the character and the viewer to perform intellectual work, which is ultimately crucial to the ghost's mission to compel action. I turn now to the contemporary USA Network television show, Mr. Robot. In a nutshell, Mr. Robot is a show about hackers, hacktivists, and cybersecurity. The central protagonist, Elliot Alderson, is a socially awkward computer genius who works as a programmer for a cybersecurity firm, Allsafe. There is an irony to this. Allsafe's largest client is Ecor, a company, we learn, that was responsible for Elliot's father's radiation poisoning and subsequent death from leukemia. As he explains in the first episode, when I think about the really bad people, Ecor, the largest conglomerate in the world, they're so big they're literally everywhere, a perfect monster of modern society. The E might as well stand for evil. We learn in the opening minutes that he's troubled by the injustice around him. He goes on, "Sometimes I dream of saving the world, saving everyone from the invisible hand, the one that brands us with an employee badge, the one that forces us to work for them, the one that controls us every day without knowing it. But I can't stop it. I'm not that special. I'm just anonymous. I'm just alone." Nevertheless, early in the season, he does try to save everyone from the invisible hand in a small way. By night, he's a vigilante hacker, seeking to right the wrongs he sees in society and in the lives of the people he cares about. In the first episode, he exposes a child pornographer and then later hacks into his therapist's life, finds out that her boyfriend is married and lying to her, and forces him to confess to her. Also Also in this first episode, while Elliot is on the subway, a man wearing a uniform with a Mr. Robot patch sewn onto the front addresses him. He says, "Hey, hey you, hey kiddo, what's happening?" Elliot turns to look at him, and the man continues, "It's an exciting time in the world right now, exciting time." Later, after being called in to Allsafe to fix an E-Core hack by a group he has never heard of called F Society, Elliot is once again confronted by Mr. Robot. Mr. Robot takes him to an old, unused arcade on Coney Island. There he meets the hackers known as F Society. In the following scene, Mr. Robot takes Elliot to the Ferris wheel. I'm going to show you this scene. That's Mr. Robot and Elliot here. Uh-oh.
The speakers on the
You can go to the previous.
I did this should do it here. Let me try here.
Hey, you like Ferris wheels? Oh, it's beautiful. It's better the higher up you go. Love it here. Like it?
I'm here to tell you I'm turning you in. Giving them all the information.
Let me tell you why we're really here. You're here because you sense something wrong with the world. Something you can't explain. But you know it controls you and everyone you care about.
What are you talking about?
Money. Money hasn't been real since we got off the gold standard. It's become virtual. Software, the operating system of our world. And Elliot, we are on the verge of taking down this virtual reality. Think about it. What if you could take down one conglomerate? A conglomerate so deeply entrenched in the world's economy that too big to fail doesn't even come close to striking it.
You want to create another financial meltdown like the one we just had, but way worse. Yeah, why would I want that? Everyone would lose their money.
What if I told you that this conglomerate just so happens to own 70% of the global consumer credit industry? Huh? If we hit their data center just right, we could systematically format all the servers, including backup.
That would erase
All the debt we owe them. Every record of every credit card, loan, and mortgage would be wiped clean. It'd be impossible to reinforce outdated paper records. It would all be gone. The single biggest incident of wealth redistribution in history.
Evil Corp. The conglomerate. That's why you picked me. Does that work at Allsafe?
Tomorrow, Allsafe is going to get a visit from the FBI and the U.S. Cyber Command. You are going to modify the DAT file, put Colby's terminal IP address in there.
Terry Colby. You're gonna frame him? No one's gonna believe that. I met him, he's a moron.
So the FBI, even if they don't believe he did it, they'll believe he gave someone access to it.
And I'll just go to jail. What good will that do?
You don't take down a conglomerate by shooting them in the heart. That's the thing about conglomerates. They don't have hearts. You take them down limb by limb. As they unravel, their illusion of control unravels.
Who are you?
That'll come later. Right now, you have a lot to think about. You have to change the data file and put Colby's IP in there. You do that, You have set in motion the largest revolution the world will ever see.
So Eliot's being urged by Mr. Robot to join F Society in their large-scale hack of E-Core in order to bring about a social and economic revolution, to radically transform society by eradicating all debt. So you might be wondering what this has to do with ghosts. We learn toward the end of the season that Mr. Robot is actually Eliot's dead father, and thus, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. I'll say more about this later, but before we even get to this shocking realization, other stylistic details and strategies affect both how and what we as viewers understand about Eliot's world and his relationship to us. First of all, the very opening scene of the pilot begins with a black screen and a direct address to us, the viewer. "Hello, friend," a voice says, and then corrects itself. "That's lame. Maybe I should give you a name. But that's a slippery slope. You're only in my head. We have to remember that. Shit, it's actually happened. I'm talking to an imaginary person. What I am about to tell you is top secret, a conspiracy bigger than all of us. There's a powerful group of people out there that are secretly running the world. I'm talking about the guys no one knows about, the guys who are invisible, the top 1% of the top 1%, the guys who play God without permission." Eliot addresses us all the time, breaking the fourth wall, intruding into our space. These direct addresses are off-putting. We are denied our position of complacency just outside the frame. We're called into the action of the drama, but not through identification, not as a character in the show, but as ourselves. These stylistic devices sometimes trick us. In an appointment with his therapist, Krista, she asks him what about society disappoints him so much. He responds to her with a long monologue. He says, "Is it that we collectively thought Steve Jobs was a great man, even when we knew he made millions off the backs of children? Or is it that we voted for this, not with our regulations, but with our things, our property, or money?" It's only when Krista says, "Eliot, you're not saying anything," that we understand that we were hearing the voice in his head, even though to our eyes and ears, he appears to have spoken aloud. It's an unsettling moment because we are confused by our senses. They become untrustworthy, and we are thus forced actively to make sense of what we have seen. Once Eliot realizes that Darlene, one of the F Society hackers, is actually his sister, flash memories start coming back to him. Worried that he's going crazy, he decides to hack himself, only to discover a cache of family photos. In a startling moment for both him and us, he realizes that Mr. Robot is his father, the father who died of leukemia 20 years earlier. In a crazy state, Eliot exhorts us to calm down. I'll figure this out. I know you don't trust me. I wouldn't either. But I'm telling you, I'm remembering more and more now as time goes on. That's a plus. It's all starting to come back. And once we get all the answers, I'll be back to normal. Except for the fact that my dead father isn't really dead and is sitting across from me. At this moment, Mr. Robot arrives at his door and promises to explain it all to him. Together, they visit his childhood home and ultimately arrive at a cemetery.
Here we did it. I thought you said we were going somewhere safe. Shit. What the hell are they doing here?
Won't be long now. They tried to protect your son, but they caught up to us.
What are you talking about? That's Darlene and Angela.
Trust me, son. I wanted to tell you sooner. Things got too accelerated at the end there. You have to believe that. No matter what anyone tries to do, I will never leave you. I will always be right here. Do you understand that? They're not going to break us apart again.
What's going on? Tell me right now.
Listen to me, because we don't have much time. They're going to try and get rid of me again, and I need you to not let them.
Why would they get rid of you?
Please, Elliot, listen to me. I will never leave you. I will never leave you alone again. I love you, son.
What's he talking about? What's he talking about? Hey, I want to know. I want to know.
I want to know!
Elliot, who are you talking to?
You mean I'm talking to...
Stay back. Stay back.
Elliot, you're bleeding. Elliot. Elliot, what are you doing here?
You didn't see him?
Who?
This can't be happening. This can't be happening. This can't be happening. This is happening, isn't it?
In this scene, we and Elliot learn definitively that Mr. Robot is not actually there and hasn't been all along. This is profoundly destabilizing for Elliot, and it is for us as well. We, like Elliot, have been seeing him with our own eyes. Like Elliot, we're tricked. Our senses are rendered unreliable. The televisual medium here, like the cinema in Joan the Woman, depicts a ghost, corporealizes it. Joan the Woman's use of the ghost must have been shocking to viewers at the time, must have required them to work hard to understand the complex intertemporality with which they were being confronted. In our contemporary moment, viewers are much more sophisticated, but the plot twist in Mr. Robot comes at the end of a very long season, forcing viewers to do an enormous amount of work. The ghost, played by a well-known actor, was there in flesh and blood, and yet we infer that it was all an illusion. This ghost is unnerving, challenging both the characters' ideas about what is possible and impossible, and ours as well. Like Elliot, we're forced to cast our mind back over all of the events and to understand them in a completely different light. Like the breaking of the fourth wall, this shock snaps us out of the narrative, out of our passive position, forcing us to engage in cognitive work to make sense of what's happening, just as Elliot must. In this sense, we find ourselves in close relationship with Elliot. Our work is somehow analogous to the work he has to do. We're invited into it because we have to piece it together. Furthermore, Elliot is enmeshed in a high-stakes political project. In this way, we are made open to and complicit in the show's political message of the need to take responsibility, to take action against inequality and capitalism. Mr. Robot and the hackers in F Society are committed to a revolution, to the overthrow of capital and capitalism. The specter in this show, like the specter Derrida points to in Marx, is a call to action for an economic revolution, a radical declaration that there is work to be done and that we must do it. And while both Mr. Robot and Joan of Arc were wronged during their actual lives, the former exposed to toxic radiation by the large conglomerate for whom he worked, the latter burnt at the stake as a heretic, neither has returned with a simple revenge fantasy. Ghosts register an inequity. They connect temporalities in the service of justice, and that's where the political potential, the sense of responsibility they ask us to take on, comes from. Both of these ghosts cast their eyes toward the future, compelling, through their corporealized presence in the present, a contradiction that the viewer must reconcile. And it is in the forcing of that reconciliation that the ghost has done its job, mobilizing the characters and the viewers as well to a new intellectual understanding. In the case of Mr. Robot, the televisual technology has literalized the ghost both for him and for us, lending it an urgency and an intimacy that makes its call to action all the more compelling. My point is not that there's something inherently progressive in either the filmic or televisual medium. People can be motivated, affectively engaged for both reactionary and radical causes. However, what I'm suggesting here is that when this affective prompting happens at the hands of a ghost, always a literal embodiment of a wrong committed that cannot go away, that exists in a present albeit unseen, the demand is an ethical one. The cinema, as a technology, lends itself to the materialization of ghosts as a device for linking the past and the present in service of a call to ethical or political action. In representing the impossible, perhaps the ghost's shocking presence might be just enough to wake us up.
Thank you very much, Alison. So I will frame a couple of questions in response to Alison's paper, and then I'll open up to the floor. So, given that I came to your work through your previous book, that set me thinking about the relationship between this paper and your previous work. So, for those who don't know, Alison's first book was called Prosthetic Memory, and she argued for a relationship, an empathetic relationship between the cinema spectator and on-screen bodies, so that the spectator might begin to feel as though they had lived through the memories that, or the experiences that they were seeing represented on screen, such that those memories would actually become incorporated into their bodies as prosthetic limbs, as it were, and that would produce an ethical imperative for the spectator. And then in this paper, you talked about the film spectator experiencing shock and a kind of cognitive dissonance, but also a degree of empathy as well, I think, with the ghost, and that produces an ethical imperative too. And so then I was wondering about the relationship or the differences between witnessing a material body on screen that's nevertheless dematerialized as well by the very fact that it's on the screen, and witnessing a sort of marked dematerialized body on the screen in the form of a ghost, and how that affects the film spectator differently, both affectively and ethically.
It's a very interesting question. I want to first talk about the affect and the cognitive, because I think that's connected. So, one of the moves that I made from the first book, Prosthetic Memory, to my second book, Engaging the Past, was to move. I was interested in sort of the affective engagement that spectators have with mediated representations, and memory is a sort of personal modality. It has a collective dimension, but it also has a strongly affective dimension, a personal dimension, that history does not in the same way. And so I was interested in thinking about the fact that since these representations of the past on screen rely on affect, what does this mean for the project of history? Because history thinks of itself as being a much more sort of clinical, represents a more clinical relationship to the past. Distance is sort of essential to historians. Historians are horrified by the idea of affect. So, when we're talking about popular public representations of the past, there's a kind of a dilemma here, because if they're all about sort of affect and making viewers sort of feel connected, then maybe that's constructive for producing memory, but it might not be really constructive for producing history, right? And so I started thinking about how a representation of the past might prevent this kind of over-identification with the past. And so I became interested in these sort of relays between the affect and the cognitive. And I became interested in these representations of the past that, in addition to drawing the viewer in, engaging their bodies affectively, also had mechanisms that forced the viewer out, that reminded the viewer that they are not in the past. Because they're watching a film about the past, they don't simply know what it was like. They don't, so that I was interested in texts that reject a kind of simple, fast identification with the past. And so I was interested in basically strategies of estrangement, almost in a Brechtian sense. And I think, so then getting to the ghost, I think the ghost is really powerful in this way because the ghost is obviously not real. The ghost is it's a contrivance, it's a construction. And again, when we're watching this, we may feel sort of empathically involved with Eliot and the work he has to do, but the presence of the ghost, again, is a moment that doesn't make sense, that we can't actually lose ourselves in it because we have to think about it and we have to work to figure it out. And I think it's that sort of working to figure it out that's kind of important and in a way and different from sort of what I was sort of talking about in prosthetic memory.
Yeah, that really makes sense. And that notion of estrangement draws me on to something that I noticed because I'd read your paper in advance, and interestingly, this next question came to me as I was watching one of the clips, which registered to me that it was something about the embodiedness of watching it.
Okay.
And it's to do with the difference, the relationship between the different sorts of bodies that we see in the ghost, the person witnessing the ghost on screen, and the film spectator's body, perhaps in terms of gender differences, it could be class differences or age differences in Mr. Robot, or generational differences, but I could also think of racial differences, for example. And this occurred to me when I was watching the scene with Joan, and it occurred to me suddenly that she was called Joan the Woman, and she is being witnessed by this male military figure. And I wondered about how those differences function in relation to empathy or dissonance, or those different sorts of affects.
I mean, it's such a great question because, I mean, there's a whole, I sort of dodged in the paper, there's so much to be said about gender in the film. And I couldn't take it all on right now, but he calls the film Joan the Woman because he wanted to emphasize her as a flesh and blood person, not as a sort of just as a political ideal. And he says that. But, you know, she has a romantic relationship with Eric Trent. Oh, she doesn't. They're on the verge of having a romantic relationship in the 15th century. But she's the female aggressor. I mean, she is the one who has all the power, and he's almost dead. She nurses him back to health. So she's a very, very powerful figure. And the men in the present in the trench, Eric Trent and his other companion, they when they're looking at the sword and they're trying to figure out who it belonged to, they said, "Oh, I wonder what chap this belonged to." You know, and they're assuming, of course, that it was a man that the sword belonged to. And then Joan appears, and so I don't really have an answer to the difference it makes that she's a woman. But all I can tell you is there's a lot to be said about the fact that they misunderstand that the sword was actually a woman. When they see her, he sort of reaches out to her and she pulls away. I mean, she's not. And that's what happens in the 15th century as well. She's not attainable to him. She won't give herself over to him because she sort of believes in what she believes in. But I don't know that her being a female ghost, I don't know. I haven't thought enough about it. I don't have an answer to that question of what difference
It seems like another layer of the ethics and politics of that.
It does, and I think
that's maybe a sub-layer.
It's a great point and something I really need to think about as I continue to develop this.